team. We have been first extracting data from Twitter, and we will talk about the protocols and the extent of our data. It is huge. And then we also wanted to develop ways to operationalize some social science, political science concepts, so that we can study some of the pertinent questions related to Turkish politics recently in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the kind of methods we employ are called computational social science. Our team is, again, as just mentioned, composed of political scientists and computer scientists from the TOBB University, as well as our friend and colleague Evren Hoca. She's a former faculty member, but now she is teaching in the United States. And also Yavuz Selim Kartal, he was Mücahit Hoca's graduate student, but currently he is doing his PhD. Found interesting results, which we will share and which we hope to also present them later, maybe also receive feedback from you. The main motivation of our research was to understand this concept of polarization, which has been one of the buzzwords of studies on Turkish politics in recent years. Quite many surveys in the past have found that in Turkish society there is an increasing degree of polarization, and polarization is shaping Turkish public's attitudes, reactions to many events. And then, as a polarized society, the literature also further argues that the progress of Turkish democracy also suffers because polarization does not just stand as a social phenomenon, it has definitely political implications. And then quite many studies in the last 10, 15 years, supported by the traditional surveys, have argued for the relevance, presence of polarization in the Turkish society. But at the same time, we have another parallel development, which is the social media, how it is becoming a platform to express social and political opinions, attitudes, and increasingly this is where quite a big part of the political debate, political discussion is taking place. But studying social media, considering the new nature of this media outlet, requires quite new techniques, methodologies than the conventional methodologies. And then we hear a lot about what's going on in the social media sphere, especially in terms of polarization, the use of offensive language, sometimes hate crime, and also the issue of misinformation or disinformation or fake news. There are different literatures overlapping around the same theme. So we wanted to understand how we can develop some unique methodologies to study these concepts, the issue of echo chambers, mainly polarization, the issue of use of offensive language, as well as the issue of the misinformation or disinformation. But of course, there was this interesting case, which was the pandemic, which affected many of the social and political discussions. The pandemic, as we have all observed, started as a health crisis, but immediately it turned into a big social and political issue. Of course, it has had economic repercussions as well, as we experience in our daily lives, the economic repercussions, the crisis of the pandemic. But at the same time, the policies that were developed to address the pandemic, they also became part of the daily political discussions. And in this sense, the pandemic itself became part of the polarized nature of daily politics and social discussions. So our idea was to look at the pandemic period and try to understand what's going on, how those patterns of polarization have affected the discussion taking place on social media related to pandemic. And in that respect, we formed our research team. And then the first task was to develop a sort of classification of Twitter users. So in that respect, we believe our study is one of the first, if not the only study to rise for such a challenge, because first you have to identify different attributes, characteristics of the users. And usually in traditional surveys, what you do, you ask people questions, right? What's your ideology? Do you support the government or not? Do you define yourself as secular or religious? So on and so forth. But here, you have just the Twitter users and their tweet posts. And then you have to guess their characteristics, ideology, religiosity, political orientation. So the question of operationalization of the users and their categories, this was a big challenge. And to do so, actually, we did a kind of initial screening workshop with the experts, political scientists. Aydın was there and quite many other colleagues from around Turkey. We wanted to develop a way to decide what kind of categories we can use to describe our users. And of course, in Turkish politics, when we talk about, for instance, polarization, Kurdish versus Turkish or other ethnic background, this is one of the main items. But here in the Twitter sphere, we thought we cannot really try to guess the ethnic identity. Same goes also for the gender, for instance. We wanted to develop a model to guess, but we thought it would be futile. So instead, we thought that we can at least try to guess certain attributes of the users based on their political attributes. So by looking at the kind of posts the Twitter users are posting, we can guess their political orientation, religiosity, ideology, and stance on the government. And then we also added to this the issue of vaccination, whether the users are anti-vaccine or pro-vaccine. And this is where I turn to Mücahit Hoca to explain a bit, very briefly, to the layman how their computer science model worked.
So for us, very huge data, and we basically call TVs. One of the questions is why we use TVs, why it's in the social media platform is mainly Twitter is sharing their data. They are very generous in sharing their data for research studies, so that is the main reason we focus on tweets. And then, well, we created actually two data sets. The first one is we tracked keywords related to COVID-19, which is like vaccine, COVID-19, pandemic, and of course they are Turkish versions because we collected Turkish TVs. And this crawl actually lasted for roughly 6 months. So from June 24th, 2021 to the end of the year. And well, but this kind of TVs actually is giving us individual tweets, not about users. So people, and they're all about COVID-19, but we also wanted to know people, who they are. So because we want to develop also prediction models to predict their political orientation and their stance and so on. So at some point we also detected user profiles, and download all of their tweets they shared from once they created their account, and we crawled all tweets they posted. Of course, all available tweets which are not deleted, which are still available. And this resulted in very huge data for us. We crawled 800,000 users profiles, and in total they have 1.2 billion tweets. And this is one data set, and the other one is but this user profile data set can be about anything. So it can be about COVID, it can be about sports, politics, everything. But the other data set is pure about COVID-19. And I will skip some technical details, but eventually we predicted the stance of users, their political orientation using their profiles, and then do some other analysis on the COVID specific data. Well, and should I move? Okay. Well, I'll come to yeah, wait a second. What we did is we manually labeled 600 users to predict their political stance, political orientation, religiosity, and so on. And then we first developed a deep learning model. Everyone thinks that deep learning, it solves everything. They're super good, but actually it didn't work well for Turkish. And then we developed another model, and this has a very great classification accuracy. And the main idea we had is that people are saying that retweets are not endorsement. They put it in their tweet profiles, and yeah, it can be true. But what usually is that people retweet tweets of people, they have some common points in terms of political stance or orientation and so on. So we thought that our retweets are actually giving us providing a very powerful hints about ourselves actually, and we adapted a method from another study, and saying that if you retweet people from a particular group, then it's more likely that you're also from that group. So this was the main intuition, and yeah, it had great classification accuracy, but we couldn't label all accounts because if people didn't retweet enough, then we were not able to label them, but still we could label more than 500,000 users, by the way. So here is the numbers we have. As you can see, eventually we could label 508,000, around 508,000 users. And you can see the numbers here for each category, religious, the ideology, and so on. But these are numbers, maybe this might be confusing. So this is the distribution of the users. So what we see here, for instance, is the blue ones are, for the religious group, for instance, the blue is the secular, the red is the religious person, and for the other column you see the ideology. Blue represents leftist, right represents rightist, red represents rightist. Well, and this is basically the distribution of the users based on our labeling process.
Yeah, as Mücahit Hoca said, we were able to quote around 500,000 accounts and attribute them certain characteristics. And the important one was about the vaccination, which we will talk more later. As you can see in our sample, the pro-vaccine accounts were quite high, almost 95%, and anti-vaccine attitudes in that respect were very limited. So we also wanted to see how this 5% anti-vaccine accounts are distributed, and this is the breakup. As you can see, overall in the sample, while anti-vaccine attitudes are small, when subdivided based on our categories, we see that in each category there is some meaningful difference. For instance, when we look at the religious users, 85% of them are pro-vaccine, only 15% are anti-vaccine, but compared to seculars, there is a difference. And the same also applies for other categories. And as we will see later in our in other parts of our study, that kind of distinction between religious versus secular, left versus right, anti-government versus pro-government, conservative versus progressive difference holds. So in this sense, in general, religious, right-wing, pro-government, conservative users tend to behave in a certain way versus the others. So that difference reflects itself in other parts of our study. And to kind of give us a kind of additional perspective on the use and how they define themselves, because first part of our study was to code them based on our machine modeling. But then we also wanted to look at how they self-identify themselves, and that's where we looked at the Twitter bios. And Mücahit Hoca, would you like to comment on the methodology on that? And you will see interesting differences between the pro-government, anti-government, secular versus religious users.
Yeah, so this is the bio part of the Twitter profile. So this is totally user-defined. The users are allowed to write anything, and they are also allowed to leave it blank. So if what we are doing is actually basically counting the number of for each word, we are counting how many of them, and then based on their frequency, we in this vertical we see that which ones are more frequent. So it's for instance here what you see is that AK Party, üyesi başkanı, kolları, these kind of words are most frequent. So this suggests that the most of the users from, as expected, from the pro-government users define themselves with AK Party. But I think we see here also the good accuracy of our stance detection. And this is, for instance, the anti-government users. So again, we see which words are most frequently used in their bios. So this allows us to have a look inside, have a deeper understanding about who these people are or these accounts actually. And we did this for anti-government, pro-government, and then this is the anti-vaccine users, for instance. What you see is actually Yeniden Refah Partisi and Hüdar. So it seems like, yeah, in our profile, the anti-vaccine users are coming mostly from these political parties actually. And we have also the pro-vaccine part for this bio.
Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned, the pro-vaccine users are in the majority. Therefore, when we look at the hashtags of pro-vaccines, there is a kind of more balanced distribution that resemble both the pro-government and anti-government. And we have separate, of course, hashtags for each category, religious versus secular, so on and so forth, but we didn't want to share all of them. But the kind of bios and the way people define themselves overlap largely with our coding, so it gives us a kind of control in terms of reliability of our coding. And then beyond these descriptive parts of our data, now we are slowly moving into more analytical part. As we mentioned, the intention behind the project was to sort of understand how the Twitter users interact. And in this part, we are gonna look at the interactions. And this is where we think we can partly understand this issue of echo chambers, indirect, of course, polarization, and also in particular this issue of the offensive language. with the interactions, would you like to talk about the mentions model?
Sure. So we currently what we have is that we have hundreds of thousands of users, labeled users, and we have all their profiles. So we know all of their TVs, who they send a reply or whether they mentioned a particular user and so on. So using that, what we are able to see is that how many times they even interacted with accounts from other groups. For instance, if they are pro-vaccine, are they talking about more about interacting with pro-vaccine accounts or anti-vaccine accounts, or and what is the frequency? So we basically counted how many times each user mentioned a user from a particular group, and here we have the results. So this is the results for 1 year from this beginning of the 2010 and the end of the 2021, and we counted around 26.6 million mentions. So this is, we ignored all the tweets that doesn't mention any user, but we only focus on the tweets that interact with other accounts.
So, I mean, this is also the graphic representation of the table frequencies. So as you can see, when people interact with other users by using our metric of the mentions, we see that in-group interactions are more than out-group interactions. So usually the Twitter users tend to engage more with the people from the same group versus the opposite group. And of course, the percentages differ. So in that sense, we can say that certain groups are more closed, they tend more to talk to the people from the same background versus others. So variation across categories is also very relevant here. But here, for instance, an interesting finding is about the anti-vaccine users. Their degree of interaction with the outer group is the highest. So compared to all other groups, they are the ones that engage more with the opposite group versus the same group. So this is, we will see later, it comes up also in other parts of our study, that group is very active. So this is, in our understanding, a reflective of sort of agenda setting behavior, in the sense that they want to push for a certain agenda. They are very active, they are dominating the discussions. Also, we will see with the hashtags and disinformation as well. So this group is small, but very eager to engage with other groups. This is our reading of it. So this is the summary of our methodology here. Then we also wanted to look at the kind of language in which the users engage with each other. Engagement is one, but the kind of language they use is another thing. So this is why we also wanted to look at offensive language issue.
And in order to do that, we did some natural language processing analysis. So we want to know, okay, so they interact, but what is their tone? How do they speak with the other person? Are they using some, are they talking nicely, or are they, or do they have some offensive language towards the other people or to the accounts from the same group? So we basically developed a deep learning model for Turkish offensive language detection. So basically this model, we give a tweet for that model, and it returns us whether it is an offensive, it has an offensive language or not. And we did our accuracy analysis, and then we run this model on the all TVs that mentions that mentions another user. So we apply this to all TVs which interact with other users. By the offensive language, what we mean is here you see some examples. So we close the actual account name with the red blocks, you can see, but the tweets are well, it's sometimes hard to read those tweets, so I will leave it to you. I don't want to read those offensive language tweets with offensive language, but basically it's not hate speech, by the way, it is, but it should be a rude, offensive language. So this is what we are trying to detect using our model. And here are the results based on our model.
Yeah, again, the frequencies, and then this is the distribution. So left side of the chart versus the right side. Left side shows within group, not offensive and offensive tweets. Right hand side shows intergroup not offensive, intergroup offensive. So overall, as we said, I mean, the use of offensive language was also limited. It is not huge, but when we subdivide, when we look at specific categories, pro-vaccine versus anti-vaccine, progressive versus conservative, so on and so forth, we see that there are differences. Overall, again, we see a similar pattern. Most users tend to use more offensive language vis-a-vis users' opposite group versus most users tend to use less offensive language vis-a-vis people from the same group. So here we are able to see for each particular group the rate of offensive mentions. So the blue ones, the blue bars, represent intergroup offensive mentions in the all mentions that were recorded by that particular category. And then within group is marked in red. Overall, the graphic tends to show that religious users tend to use the highest rate of offensive language vis-a-vis the secular ones, and the religious users tend to use the least offensive language vis-a-vis the same category, which is the other religious users. Again, in other categories, you see the tendency. And then anti-vaccine, pro-vaccine, you see the same tendencies as well. So we also took the average of these offensive mentions. That's a bit of technicality because, as we mentioned before, not all users engage in Twitter at the same rate. Some tend to send a lot of tweets, some less. So to account for this, to get a more balanced representation, we also wanted to get a more proportional distribution, and this
and the blue ones shows the total TVs, and the red ones shows the offensive TVs labeled as offensive. And you see there's a green line there, and then after that point you see that the number of tweets have been gradually decreasing. This is where we started to grow Twitter profiles, and it took 2 or 3 months, I mean, took like 2 months to grow these 800,000 profiles of 800,000 users. So that's why our whole, that's why you see that when, for instance, in the October, we started growing in September. If we growed a user in September, we didn't have their TVs in October. So that's the main reason. But for the users who have that we crawled their profile in, for instance, November or November, we also have their tweets in October. That's why the reason is that the number of tweets after September is decreasing, but it doesn't mean that the number of interactions decreased after September. What we see is that actually the interactions gradually increase during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, this overall interaction rate, the time series, gives us some indication that people's users' engagement during the pandemic increase. You see it at the start of the pandemic, March 2020, the first measures introduced. I have read some studies, other studies also have findings similar in the sense that engagement with media, different media platforms has increased, which is understandable. People are sometimes locked down, and we have seen much discussion. So this gives us an indication. Of course, the increase and decrease, there may be ways to study further if it is correlated with other factors. So these are the main takeaways, which we also mentioned, as I underlined. Overall, the offensive language is limited, but when we delve deeper into that limited offensive language, it is more toward the out group versus than in group. Next, we also wanted to look at the sort of themes that are part of the conversation taking place on the Twitter sphere. For that, there are, of course, other models to the study, the discussion topics, like topic modeling. We used it in another study, but not here. And then we wanted to look at the hashtags and what kind of hashtags have been widely used by the Twitter users, how they spread. And then based on the kind of hashtags, the different categories used, we wanted to also see the differences across groups.
And in this one, we are similar to vertical as of bios that we see before. Here we use only the hashtags from our COVID-19 specific data set. So that's why all the hashtags you see are somehow related to COVID-19, because we didn't use any, I mean, users might post tweets about other topics, but we ignore that this is, we just calculated which hashtags are more prevalent, more frequent in our data set. And you see, we did this for different groups. So here you see for the pro-government hashtags for roughly 6 months period. And then we also did it for all our user groups, like anti-government, here you see, and then anti-vaccine and pro-vaccine groups. Well, we
yeah, I mean, we have all the charts for individual subgroups, but overall, our conclusion is that when we look at the content, the messages of those hashtags with anti-pandemic measures messages are overall widely shared. So in all subcategories, on the top of the list, those hashtags with anti-measures, anti-vaccination or all other measures dominate. So in that sense, the conversation on the Twitter sphere is not taking place in terms of a positive narrative about the measures, but rather the anti-vaccine or anti-other measures kind of messages are circulating more. So in terms of the groups, again, we see a similar distribution. Religious, right-wing, conservative, pro-government users tend to produce similar hashtag distributions, word clouds. And then, especially this emphasis on the anti-vaccine, anti-measure kind of distributions may be yet another indication of how anti-vaccine users may also spread their message more. But we also wanted to take one more step, and this is where Mustafa and also Fatma, our research assistant, took some time to manually code certain hashtags, because there are thousands of hashtags, we couldn't group them all. And then we also wanted to look at specifically whether a particular hashtag is sending a pro-measure, anti-measure message, or it is neutral. We also coded them. And then you see here the distributions, overall distributions. And then by that, we are able to see, for instance, the conservatives. All hashtags used by the conservatives, how it is distributed in terms of whether it is anti-measure, whether it is neutral, or whether it is pro-measure. As you can see, in all categories, mainly anti-measure hashtags, messages dominate. Of course, there are variations. In some places, it goes different. But overall, the anti-measure hashtags are more widespread. But when compared to the different subcategories, overall, again, conservative, right-wing, pro-government, religious users tend to use more anti-measure hashtags than their counterparts. So the same polarization pattern is also visible here. And this is a reverse distribution of the same table, actually. So it tells us the reverse story in the sense that when we look at the anti-measure hashtags, how much percent of them are sent by the conservatives versus progressives? Again, we see the same distinction here in terms of the anti-measure hashtags. They are mostly shared by conservatives, pro-government, religious, right-wing, anti-vaccine users. So this is again the summary of our findings in the sense that overall, if we were to study the topics of the conversation, the themes of the conversation based on the hashtags, we see that that kind of negative narrative is there. It is dominating the discussion, which may be partly because of the successful agenda setting by the anti-vaccine groups. And then next, the hot topic also on the agenda, recent political agenda, the issue of misinformation, disinformation. There are different ways to label it. So here we just used misinformation as a general category. And briefly, Mücahit Hoca again will explain our methodology on that.
So our main question is that are there any differences among different groups in terms of sharing or spreading misinformation? Well, of course, people spread misinformation in very different ways. They can post images. For instance, they can change the images and then post it, but we are not able to do it in an automatic way. That will be very challenging. The other way is they might just make a claim, which is, and it might be, again, incorrect, might be false, but that requires a huge NLP process, and we are not able to, I mean, currently it's a very hot topic in the NLP committee to detect whether a given claim is true or not. But again, that will be, especially for Turkish, there's almost no study on that. So how we can then track the misinformation? So we actually look at the links. So we basically checked all the links, and then we detected the most popular, the most frequently shared links, and then manually check those links, whether that information in those links are fake, misleading, and we have these 5 categories, and Mustafa actually worked on that part.
Yeah. First, we were thinking about
Buradan
şimdi sessiz almayacağım. First, we were thinking about using Teyit.org or Doğruluk Payı websites that are fact-checking claims, but then we thought that like they were not shared much in our data set, so we actually choose first the first 500 links and then added another 110 links from the most shared links in our dataset, and we manually fact-check those 610 links. And so, for example, this one is misleading because it selects on the dependent variable, and it is an anti-measure link. We also categorize them if they are anti-measure or pro-measure. So we tried to guess the intent of producing a misleading article. So here it says Australia's medicine regulator confirms there have been 9 times as many deaths due to COVID-19 vaccines in just 7 months than deaths due to all other vaccines combined. So this selects on the dependent variable, which is a fallacy in statistical analysis. So when we look at the beginning of the pandemic, the intense care units in hospitals and people who were dying from COVID-19 did not have a vaccine. And then when the population get more and more vaccination, the share of vaccination among the people who are dying or people who are at the hospital started to increase. So at the beginning, actually pro-vaccine people were using this same fallacy, and after the share of vaccinated people increased among people who are dying or who are in intense care units increased, then anti-vaccine people started to use this fallacy. So we counted both as misleading because they are not representing the real cause and relationship between vaccination or people who are dying, getting sick. So these, we categorize these as anti-measure and also misleading.
Another example.
And this one actually is produced by pro-vaccine narrative, and it is also the same fallacy as I said. And it says, "I'm sorry, but it's too late. Alabama doctor on treating unvaccinated dying COVID patients." So at the beginning, so this is like July 2021. So when the rate of vaccination was low, and also when people who are unvaccinated are more in the population, they are also represented in the hospitals. And if the whole population is vaccinated, of course, some of them will get sick. And so the 100% of people who are at the hospital will be vaccinated. So this is the same fallacy. So then we looked at the number of shares these links received. And here we have their number, 610. And they were shared in total around 250,000 times. And we checked the distribution among each category. And here we categorize them as factual, fake and misleading, and also unrelated to the pandemic. And also there were some links we were uncertain about because of our qualifications. We are not medical doctors. We couldn't decide if it is true or not. Then we left them as uncertain. But here, as you see, fake and misleading ones at the end, like they consist of like 14%. And in terms of sharing, they are like 16%. But the others, like they are relatively low. And as takeaway, fake or misleadings were like around 14% of our sample. And the spread of disinformation, at least in our data set, remains relatively low.
Yeah, I guess this is the %15 fake misleading news. Is it big or not? Mücahit Hoca says it's pretty big. I say it is relatively low. So we can debate later, really. I mean, it is definitely something that we need to be concerned, the degree of misinformation there, but also the spread of misinformation, to what extent is a real threat. There is a literature on that as well. And then especially the methodology we used, looking at the links. And then I see in the international literature as well, in the American case as well. So the links that send you to really fake news are very limited, but sometimes it is the mainstream media that amplify the social media's spread of misleading news. So this is an issue that needs further discussion, definitely. But our categorization was, in that sense, unique. We wanted to separate between the fake and misleading news. Most of the time, they are lumped together. There is not this nuanced treatment. Alternatively, at the beginning, actually, we were planning to use teyit.org. As you know, there are such fact-checking websites and services. This is one strategy to deal with the misinformation issue. But somehow their rate of producing reliable observation, the number of observations, didn't really serve our needs. That's why we developed this unique technique of going by our own links, manually finding out the fake, misleading news and analyzing them. So for further analysis, we reduced the bars further. We lumped together, merged fake and misleading together, and we compared them to the rest, so to speak. I won't bore you much with all these statistics. And again, same patterns more or less are there. Distribution of fake, misleading links within the groups varies. From one group to another, we have certain differences. And then sometimes those differences are big, sometimes small. These are our overall conclusions from that part of our study. In general, the links shared by the users are mostly the factual links, and then fake, misleading news are small, between 10 to 22%, depending on the category. When we look at specific groups in our sample, among the left-wing users, it is the lowest. Anti-vaccine users, again, an interesting category which we identified earlier, are highest in terms of sharing fake, misleading news. Again, we did further statistical analysis. We won't go further into that. Next, Mustafa said we can do one more round of manual coding. As Cem Yılmaz says in Gora, bu halıyı dokuyan çocuğun gözleri kör oldu. Mustafa wanted to code more and Fatma said, why not? And then we went one more round of manual coding. We wanted to see the stance of the fake news, fake and misleading news. It is fake, but in favor of whom? What narrative it is spreading? In favor of the measures or in favor against the pandemic measures? And therefore, we made another round of manual coding of the, this time just fake and misleading links. And this is where you want to talk about, you see the distributions.
Yes, here again, we check their stance on the pandemic measures, but I have to say that these are only 86 links, and we compared the number of shares they received. So among the pro-government, anti-vaccine, religious, right-wing and conservative, they are much higher compared to progressive, left-wing, secular, pro-vaccine and anti-government users. So as we saw earlier, the number of anti-vaccine people are a bit higher among the pro-government and religious right-wing conservative. So here we see the same pattern. And pro-measure links were much lower in distribution. So like 4% here, and yeah, overall they had like the anti-measure links were more prevalent than links favoring the measures. And as I said, it was higher among pro-government than anti-government, and the similar pattern in all other categories.
Yes, so in terms
of spreading fake or misleading news, the anti-narratives were again stronger. Then the next, this is the last analytical part of our project. Then we will go to the overall conclusions. We also wanted to develop a measure, a way to understand how people reacted to the public policies, public measures. As we have all experienced individually, personally, during the course of the pandemic, the public authorities introduced several measures to manage this health emergency. And then we wanted to use the public reactions by looking at the sentiments. There is something called the sentiment analysis. This is what we did.
So for the sentiment is actually can be considered as a, do we have a positive opinion on something or negative opinion? So it's different than stance. So it's actually, and to do that, we also developed a model for Turkish text to detect whether the sentiment in the text is positive or whether it is negative. And here, for instance, you see some examples for the positive and negative sentiments. So it might help to understand what we mean by the positive sentiment. For instance, here you say Allah'tan Ramazan geldi, Covid'in sonunda geldi. So the person who says has some positive feelings about about some topic, but for the negative ones, for instance, it's not only emotion, but actually it's the people's opinion and people's orientation for a specific topic. So we built a Turkish sentiment analysis for this topic, and then we another challenge we had is, well, social media talks about everything, but we want to know the sentiment for a very specific topic. So how we do that is first we identified major public policy measures, and there were actually, as you know, many different measures taken at different times, but we identified the 14 different ones. And then using our data sets, we look at and we want to know what is the difference. So if is the sentiment of the people changed by the reaction, by the measure? So we first look at the average sentiments of tweets posted 3 days before the measure taken. So 3 days, 2 days, and 1 day. So there's a 3 days period. And then there is an announcement day. And then we also look at the, again, the average sentiment in the tweets after 3 days of the measure. And here you see the 14 measures we focused on. And one challenge again is that, as I said, people talk about everything. It can be about football, it can be about politics, it can be about the measure. So we also identified some keywords for each these measures, and then we only detected sentiments of those of tweets that contain those kind of that contain keywords that we manually selected.
So here you see the list of the measures we particularly looked at. Evren Hoca identified them because, as you know, there were several rounds of different measures, and then she studied them and she said these are the most relevant and these are the dates which we picked up. And around those days, as Mücahit Hoca said, we looked at the sentiments. So there are the distributions of sentiments. I personally am still looking at it and trying to see what it tells me. Sometimes I see a pattern, sometimes not. So this is what we see, Mücahit Hoca.
For each of them, we might, let me talk about how we might read it. So as we have higher numbers, it means that the sentiment of the TVs are increasing on average. So for instance, for the leftmost part, we see that, for instance, the sentiment is increasing before the anti-measure announcement, but then once it is announced, which is in the yellow column in the middle, then it starts decreasing. So it suggests that people might not be happy with the announcement, so that the sentiment of the tweets are decreasing after the announcements. Well, in some cases, we see very fluctuations. In those cases, yeah, this is hard to understand what is going on, but this might be people are, at the end actually we'll talk about the limitations, but it might be due to the model's limitation. It might be people talking about lots of things, and then that might change the topic, and there might be some other measures that intersects, that have some intersects with our measures. So that is also another challenge we are having is, so, but at least for some of the measures, we see that there's a clear pattern in terms of average sentiment, but for some of them, yeah, there's a fluctuation that it is harder to interpret.
Yeah, I mean, on those days, sometimes there's a football match, you never know. Sometimes there's another spectacular event. Sometimes there's the measure, but the interior minister said he's resigning. So you never know what is happening. You have to study, but at least in many of the measures, at least the bars, while going up and suddenly goes down, or the other way around. So there is a breakdown in the sentiment trend. But again, the social media is really quite reactive day to day, hour to hour. Sometimes it may be difficult to really find out why and to what people are reacting, assuming that we are, of course, measuring the sentiments correctly. Slowly, we are moving to the conclusion part of our presentation. So the significance and contribution, Mücahit Hocam, from a computer science perspective, perhaps?
Well, first, one of the main contributions of that is we are dealing with a very really huge data. We examined 800,000 users. We could label 500,000 of them. In total, they have 1.2 billions of TVs. So these kind of, I mean, we can never analyze them manually. So that's because of this huge data. And for that, we also, from a more computer science perspective, we developed 3 different models like stance detection, offensive language detection, and sentiment analysis. And I can also, this is, I mean, I just talk about the technical part now.
Yes, we believe it is significant. We were able to identify some patterns, trends, and especially these categorizations of users and the relationship between the users' categories and the issues of misinformation, offensive language, and polarization. I think these are significant, but still, we also would love to draw attention to the limitations of our study. We are aware of the limitations, both from the perspective of the model, but also especially in terms of the kind of sample we are working with.
So we are working on the social media data. So this is not about the real life. So whenever we say actually religious person, pro-government person, and so on, they are accounts, they are not actual, they might not be actual people actually. And so this is not to say that what we see here is happening in the real life, but we have some biases from other sources, and I'll talk about in more with limited technical detail. Each machine learning algorithm actually introduces its own bias. They I mean, as a human beings, we have biases to our thinking with, and to decide on issues, and machines have much more that they amplify the these biases. So we might not be able to label a particular group. We might, and for instance, from our bios word cloud, you see that vaccine users are coming mostly from Yeniden Refah Partisi and Hüdapar. So, and most of them, this suggests that a big chunk of the anti-vaccine users are from these 2 political parties, and you can, I mean, look at the ratio of their vote and in the real life. So this is coming from one of the machine learning algorithms we have, and also they are not working perfectly. They are good. They are really good in terms of accuracy, but they are not perfect. So we shouldn't make huge claims if some numbers are higher than the others and so on. If there's a really big change, then yeah, it gives us some idea. But if the numbers are small, we should be more, we should take a grain of salt when we are considering these numbers. The other one is the presence of bots. So actually we use a tool to detect social bots, which is known as botometer, which is the very famous one. And we actually run it for like 300,000 users. But then we manually analyzed it, whether are they really bot or not. And then we decided not to use it. And I can also refer you to some existing literature on that, the high false positive problem in social bot detections. For instance, if you give Elon Musk or Joe Biden's account, it also says social bot. So that's why instead of fooling us saying that we eliminated bots in our data, we take the other option is that accepting the reality, there are bots, yes, there might be. Instead of assuming that we eliminated that, we know that there might be bots. So instead of maybe saying users, it might be even better to say accounts. So that's, yes, there might be some bots, and unfortunately, and from a computer science perspective, actually, it's almost impossible to detect whether an account is a social bot or not. So this is a huge problem we have. So these are the technical biases, and there's also social media usage habits. And I'll leave for Shaban Hoca for this.
Yeah, I mean, also from a research design perspective as well, there are limitations. I mean, we do data, we have a list of Twitter users, but we don't claim that they are really a representative sample from a proper research design perspective. First, I mean, to what extent Twitter reflects the Turkish society in general, this is an open question. As you have seen in our 500 plus thousand users, left-wing, secular, progressive, anti-government users are majority. Of course, this doesn't reflect the Turkish society's actual social trends and reality. So overall, we checked different research groups whether there is any study about the composition of the Twitter users versus the Turkish society. There is none. But the anecdotal evidence suggests that the Twitter users are mostly anti-government, more secular, so on and so forth. In a sense, our results, the distribution in our sample reflects that anecdotal evidence, but we cannot be certain. But still, since they are not drawn in a random manner, yes, they are random, but it is not necessarily representative. And then a big issue here, another big issue is about the motivations. We shared with you different results, like sharing the misinformation links or sometimes the hashtags, but we don't know the motivation. Okay, we can say the religious users shared them more than the seculars, but is it because they are religious and they shared it? For what purpose did they share it? So we don't know. So therefore, we say that our results should be taken with a grain of salt, in the sense that we don't want to make broader causal generalizations. This is always so. We are just saying that in our sample, this is the pattern, the relationship we see, but we refrain from making broad causal inferences. This is our important note for what we said already so far, and we can also in the future talk about how continue this project. We can look at different dimensions. Jad, would you like to talk on that?
Yeah. For instance, from more technical perspective, we might focus on to label users with fewer bias. So how can we get a representative sample from social media and reduce our bias coming from our machine learning models? And we didn't want to use results of social bots detection algorithms, but of course that's another direction that if we can find a more trustworthy methodology to detect bots and trolls, maybe, then that will be interesting. And it is focused on Twitter, but maybe other social media platforms like LinkedIn or YouTube comments, that might be give us also another that will be also an interesting study for a future work.
Evren, would you like to talk about our broader conclusion?
Okay. All good. Okay, one more time. Okay. Yeah, just leave me there after everyone is all exhausted with our tables. So basically, we have done all of this massive data mining and analysis for what purpose? Essentially, there are the literature on political communication, democracy has some very drastic findings One of them being that almost half of the citizens are now getting their news from social media. And social media is not mediated the way regular media is. It doesn't follow any journalistic norms. And given left to themselves, people tend to communicate with people like them, that the echo chambers, polarization. So these things are hampering the democratic coexistence models. So basically what we are in the grand scheme trying to do is how helpful and constructive is social media engagement, specifically on this issue of COVID, versus how much it is possibly potentially undermining the democratic progress. So that's why we are trying to find relevant categories, political categories, and they are not necessarily the left-right spectrum. We have multi-level categorization across different groups. And also we're looking at the tone of civic engagement. So which groups are engaging in a more civic fashion, which groups are using more offensive language. And some of the findings, frankly, surprised us because, every time, at least this is my personal experience, or a lot of the stuff, like we get hammered by very aggressive rhetoric attacks in Twitter. But when you look at the massive data, the maximum amount of offensive speech we could find was 10%. So that means 90% of the time, people are having civil discourse, that they are engaging with each other within group or between different groups in a civilized fashion. We also observed greater social media engagement during the pandemic. So that's the trend, and that's similar to, for example, other election research, 2016, 2020, social media engagement increased in the US during election times, during pandemic times, especially when we were all cooped in the houses in front of our screens. So basically, this is a relevant platform for political scientists to look at. We were, again, pleasantly surprised to find that vaccination was not a massive polarization issue. But we also noticed that there is kind of a small but feisty group of anti-vaccine folks. So even though from the traditional media, we were hearing that there is a strong anti-vax group, when we look at social media, we see that they are very minor group, but their engagement level, their activism is quite high. The misinformation stuff, this bothers all of us, again, because we as political scientists see this as, allow me to quote a little bit literature here. So when we look at the misinformation literature, which is mostly done in the US or in the West before French elections. So that's the other thing I want to insert, that our research is among the most comprehensive studies of Twitter space in the Turkish language, because the majority of the literature is very much dominated by the Anglo-American world. So some depressing findings is that when you look at average spread of true news, real stuff versus fake news, false news, doğru şey yapmadan öbürü 9 köyü aşmış, öyle bir deyimimiz vardı ya, neydi o? Yalancı bir şey olmuş. So basically, the folks, here is the finding. The fake news spread so much faster to 1,000 people. For the true news to spread to that 1,000 people, true news needs 6 times more time. So basically, the fake news spreads 6 times faster than real news, okay? And well, why should we worry? There's a lot of fake news about shark attacks, okay, or killer bats or something. You know, there's fake news on everything. They have also studied, you know, fake news. So one big finding, fake news is more contagious. It spreads so much faster. Second, politics dominates the fake news. About, you know, 40% of, you know, let's say, you know, of all the fake news, 40% of it is politics. The second big category, about with 30%, is urban legends. Okay, so the elevator eating people, or number 13, you know, seats dropping in the airplane. So whatever the urban legend is, all of this fake stuff, it's even not as much prominent as political fake news. So this misinformation, you know, the numbers we are finding is about 14, 15, 16 at most percent. Basically, you know, 1 out of 6 news that people encounter links is fake news. So this could be worrisome. The other thing is the political vulnerability of populations, especially during election times, that the likelihood of spreading fake news so much faster is manipulated by political actors, okay? So it creates a vulnerability in the population, which we think deserves more attention. So, but next, not everybody consumes fake news the same way. So there are certain groups who consume fake news more than the other groups. This, again, there are studies on US elections, and basically in 2016, when Hillary Clinton lost, the amount of fake news that the Republicans faced were multiple times, 3-4 times more than the amount of fake news the Democrats consumed. So certain political categories, certain political groups tend to be more likely to consume misleading and you know, fake news links, misleading links, and that creates, again, problems for democracy. I don't know if anybody remembers, but some guy with the gun busted a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C., looking for child human trafficking, because that was one of the fake news. Finally, you know, we can look at the reactions to public policies, but I'll jump to our last conclusion. So basically, what we are trying to do here is we are looking at the data, from a massive amount of data from the Turkish Twitter space, and we're trying to see if we can generalize from these results. Are we in tune with other research on Twitter, on social media, on polarization, on misinformation, and even on COVID, and how far Turkey deviates, or how much Turkish example can also contribute to the literature. And I will stop there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is, I guess, more or less the end from our end. We would be happy to hear if you have any questions, comments, feedback. Fatma, mikrofonumuz var mıydı? Nedir durum? Those listening to the event through Zoom, you are also welcome to write your questions if you have any questions.
differentiate those? So I want to learn how you differentiated between offensive language and, something you would consider as hate crime. That's one thing. And I was also a little confused about the, you listed the measures and you looked at how, people reacted to those measures. But what about the time between 24th and 31st of December? So is that the period where you identified the users whose data you were going to download from Twitter? So what is that time range referring to? I guess you've looked at whether people use those keywords within that time range to identify them as a Twitter users who have mentioned something. Okay, so that means your tweets, the tweets you collected, can go back to the very early, since you have, that I wanted to.
Getting data are two separate.
Okay. So you have all tweets, since you have the historical data from, okay. So in that case, I would like to, ask you about the detection of offensive language versus more aggressive tones. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, we trained our model using a data set which is labeled whether activities contains an offensive language or not. So that's why we are saying that this is an offensive language detection model. So it's not saying that it's not a hate speech detection model. So that's why we, since we use that kind of a model, the model learns from that data set, and the model actually learns what that data set provides. And that's why we said that it is not a hate speech detection model. That's just because of the data we are using to train our model. In previous slides, actually, we did have, let me find that. Yeah. So here is so we run this R model for the tweets that interact with others. So the tweets at the bottom is the one that we used our model to detect whether it is offensive or not. So here you see 3 different tweets with offensive language, and which is detected as offensive tweet. And here are the examples for that.
Actually, this was what we were discussing before the presentation. So, conceptually, I think the 2 categories are the offensive language versus hate speech. In the hate speech, there is a kind of inclination to use a certain language based on the identity of your interlocutor, counterpart. So, this is exactly what I asked Mücahit Hoca, is it the same or not as a layman? And he says that the computer models that try to develop prediction capabilities for hate speech go for a different kind of training than. So we don't do, sort of, yes, exactly. The identity part is not there from a conceptual point of view.
And for that, we use actually a publicly available Turkish offensive data sets. So it's, so we didn't create our offensive language data set. Actually, we use a publicly available one.
We used that, and we trained
our model.
Then, and based on that, and it ran on the 500 whatever. So regarding the timing, yeah, that's exactly the mood changes, the measures, maybe the sentence correlations. So there is also a time element. Over time, people's reaction are not the same. So most definitely going on, and it's another reason to be cautious about generalizations. Thank you. But on that stance, vaccination, Mustafa has
And as
as
you
well.
pointed out, vaccination is a complicated topic because we had different vaccines, and people who are here coded as pro-vaccine, most of them do not trust Sinovac or Turcovac, but people, we mostly actually, we tried to make we categorized only those who are adamantly against Pfizer mRNA BioNTech technology, and overall being against vaccination itself. But as you said, there are different kinds of vaccines, and actually those who are like very vocal on Twitter about getting vaccinated, they were, as you said, against use of Sinovac or use of only Sinovac in Turkey at the beginning of vaccination process, because Turkey didn't have access to Pfizer, and then Pfizer came later. And then after Pfizer came, there was also announced the Turkish, the local vaccine, Turcovac, and those who were pro-vaccine in our data set, some of them may have like been against Turcovac and or not being against, but don't trust it as well as Pfizer. So there is definitely the categorization aspect there, and we focused, we limited our stance on Pfizer.
Teşekkürler. I'm Lale Tüzar from EU Delegation Turkey. First of all, thank you very much for sharing your very valuable and timely research with us, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I wonder if you had, and sorry if I missed that, if you had any geographical limitations. I think you only search for the Turkish tweets in Turkish language, but do we have any idea how many of them come from abroad, for instance, from Germany? Or within Turkey? I mean, do we have any information on that? Thank you.
Yeah, that will be a very good extension for that. But there are some challenges on that. First, the geotagging studies for Turkish is highly limited. So the only thing that we can do is to trust what people say on their profiles, and in that case they can write anything on those locations. But yeah, that will be actually, yeah, we might do that, and that will be a very good extension for that. We didn't do that. The only thing, our limitation was to tweet in Turkish and at least have one tweet about COVID-19. That was our limitation, but yeah, we didn't do any geotagging on those users. Thank you for the suggestion.
So the geotagging for users, you can do it just for the user or for each specific tweet. Maybe this message, he travels. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, and also on, I mean, roughly based on my previous studies on social media, roughly only 1% of the tweets are geotagged. I mean, the big majority of the tweets do not contain any geotags on that, so we can use what people input about their location on their Twitter profile, but it is totally user-defined, so they can write anything on it. I mean, any statement, so that does not even refer to any geographic location. But at least relying on the people who share their location on their profile, yeah, we might do extend on that also to a geographic analysis.
Other questions from the chat, Mustafa? I guess we are good. Then we thank you all for your patience. It has been a long one, very extensive sharing of data. Evan, you have anything to add? Okay, we thank you all. We will soon publish the report as well. We created a website there. It will be available, and then you can read more about the data and our conclusions. And hope to see you at another occasion. And thanks for coming again.